It is worthy of note that the waves at the point H, whatever their real magnitude may be, are magnified and rendered more obstructive by the very instrument, the telescope, which is employed to make the objects beyond more plainly visible, and thus the phenomenon is often very strikingly observed, that while a powerful telescope will render the sails and rigging of a ship when beyond the point H, or the optical horizon, so distinct that the very ropes are easily distinguished, not the slightest portion of the hull can be seen. The quote, crested waters end quote, form a barrier to the horizontal line of sight as substantial as would the summit of an intervening rock or island. In the report which appeared in the Western Daily Mercury of October 25, 1864, the following observations were also recorded. Quote, on the seafront of the Camera House, and at an elevation of 110 feet from the mean level of the sea, a plane mirror was fixed by the aid of a plumb line in a true vertical position. In this mirror, the distant horizon was distinctly visible on a level with the eye of the observer. This was the simple fact as observed by the several members of the committee which had been appointed. But some of the observers remarked that the line of the horizon in the mirror rose and fell with the eye, as also did everything else which was reflected, and that this ought to be recorded as an addendum. Granted, the surface of the sea appeared to regularly ascend from the base of the hoe to the distant horizon. The horizon from the extreme east to the west, as far as the eye could see, was a parallel to a horizontal line. End quote. The following version was recorded in the same journal of the same date, and was furnished by one of the committee, who had manifested a very marked aversion to the doctrine that the surface of all water is horizontal. Quote, a vertical looking-glass was suspended from the camera, and the horizon seen in it, as well as various other objects reflected, rising and falling with the eye. The water was seen in the glass to ascend from the base of the hoe to the horizon. The horizon appeared parallel to a horizontal line. End quote. It will be observed that the two reports are substantially the same and very strongly corroborate the remarks made at pages 15, 16, and 17, the beginning of section 1. Indeed, no other report could have been given without the authors becoming subject to the charge of glaring, obstinate, and willful misrepresentation. What then has again been demonstrated? Well, that the surface of all water is horizontal, and that, therefore, the earth cannot possibly be anything other than a plane. All appearances to the contrary have been shown to be purely optical and adventitious. Another proof that the surface of the water is horizontal and that therefore the earth cannot be a globe is furnished by the following experiment, which was made in May 1864 on the new pier of Southsea near Portsmouth. Section 13, Image 2. A telescope was fixed upon a stand and directed across the water at Spithead to the pier head at Ryde in the Isle of Wight as shown in the subjoined diagram. The line of sight crossed a certain part of the funnel of one of the regular streamers trading between Portsmouth and the Isle of Wight, and it was observed to cut or fall upon the same part during the whole of the passage to Ryde Pier, thus proving that the water between the two piers is horizontal because it was parallel to the line of sight from the telescope fixed at Southsea. If the earth were a globe, the channel between Ryde and Southsea would be an arc of a circle, and, as the distance across is 4.5 statute miles, the center of the arc would be 40 inches higher than the two sides, and the steamer would have ascended an inclined plane for 2.25 miles, or to the center of the channel, and afterwards descended for the same distance towards Ryde. This ascent and descent would have been marked by the line of sight falling 40 inches nearer to the deck of the streamer when on the center of the arc of water, as represented in the following diagram. This is section 13, number 3. But as the line of sight did not cut the steamer lower down when in the center of the channel, and no such ascent and descent was observed, it follows necessarily that the surface of the water between Southsea and the Isle of Wight is not convex, and therefore the earth as a whole is not a globe. The evidence against the doctrine of the earth's rotundity is so clear and perfect, and so completely fulfills the conditions required in special and independent investigations that it is impossible for any person who can put aside the bias of previous education to avoid the opposite conclusion that the Earth is a plane. This conclusion is greatly confirmed by the experience of mariners in regard to certain lighthouses. Where the light is fixed and very brilliant, it can be seen at a distance, which the present doctrine of the Earth's rotundity would render altogether impossible. For the instance, at page 35 of Lighthouses in the World, the Ryde Pier light, erected in 1852, is described as a bright fixed light 21 feet above the high water and visible from an altitude of 10 feet at the distance of 12 nautical or 14 statute miles. The altitude of 10 feet would place the horizon at the distance of 4 statute miles from the observer. The square of the remaining 10 statute miles multiplied by 8 inches will give a fall or curvature downwards from the horizon of 66 feet. Deduct from this 21 feet, the altitude of the light, and we have 45 feet as the amount which the light would ought to be below the horizon. By the same authority, at page 39, the Bidston Hill Lighthouse near Liverpool is 228 feet above high water, one bright fixed light visible 23 nautical or very nearly 27 statute miles. Deducting 4 miles for the height of the observer, squaring the remaining 23 miles, and multiplying that product by 8 inches, we have a downward curvature of 352 feet. From this, deduct the altitude of the light to 28 feet, and there remains 124 feet as the distance which the light should be below the horizon. Again, at page 40, quote, "The lower light on the calf of man is 282 feet above the high water and is visible 23 nautical miles." End quote. The usual calculation will show that it ought to be 70 feet below the horizon. At page 41, the Cromer light is described as having an altitude of 274 feet above high water and is visible 23 nautical miles, whereas it ought to be, at that distance, 78 feet below the horizon. At page 9 it said, quote, "The coal fire, which once was used, on the Spurn Point lighthouse at the mouth of the Humber, which was constructed on a good principle for burning, has been seen 30 miles off. If the miles here given are nautical measure, they would be equal to 35 statute miles. Deducting 4 miles as the usual amount for the distance of the horizon, there will remain 31 miles, which is squared and multiplied by 8 inches, and will give 640 feet as the declination of the water from the horizon to the base of the lighthouse, the altitude of which is given at page 42 as 93 feet above high water. This amount deducted from the above 640 feet would still leave 547 feet as the distance at which the Spurn light ought to have been below the horizon. The 2 high Whitby lights are 240 feet above high water, see page 42, and are visible 23 nautical miles at sea. The proper calculation will be 102 feet below the horizon. At page 43, it is said that the lower Farne Island light is visible for 12 nautical or 14 statute miles, and the height above high water is 45 feet. The actual calculation will show that this light ought to be 67 feet below the horizon. The Heckingen light on the west coast of Norway, see page 54, is 66 feet above high water and visible 16 statute miles. It ought to be sunk beneath the horizon 30 feet. The Togem light, see page 55, on the Ringham Rock, west coast of Norway, is 51 feet high and is visible at 16 statute miles, but ought to be 45 feet below the horizon. The Rondo light, also the west coast of Norway, see page 55, is 161 feet high and is visible for 25 statute miles. The proper calculation will prove that it ought to be above 130 feet below the horizon. The Eggerø light on west point of island, south coast of Norway, see page 56, and which is fitted up with the first order of the dioptric lights, is visible for 28 statute miles, and the altitude above high water is at 154 feet. Making the usual calculation, we find this light ought to be depressed or sunk below the horizon 230 feet. The Dunkirk light on the north coast of France, see page 71, is 194 feet high and visible 28 statute miles. The ordinary calculation will show that it ought to be 190 feet below the horizon. The Gulf Bay Light on the west coast of France is said at page 77 to be visible 31 statute miles and to have an altitude of high water of 276 feet. At the distance given, it ought to be 210 feet below the horizon. Page 78, the Cordonon Light on the river Gironde, west coast of France, is given as being visible 31 statute miles and is altitude 207 feet, which would give its depression below the horizon as nearly 280 feet. The light at Madras, page 104, on the Esplanade is 132 feet high and visible 28 statute miles, whereas at the distance it ought to be beneath the horizon above 250 feet, or should say greater than 250 feet below the horizon. The Port Nicholson Light in New Zealand, erected in 1859, page 110, is visible 35 statute miles. The altitude is 420 feet above high water, and ought, if the water is convex, to be 220 feet below the horizon. The light on Cape Bonavista, Newfoundland, is 150 feet above high water and visible 35 statute miles, page 111. This will give on calculation for the Earth's rotundity 491 feet that the light should be below the horizon. Many other cases could be given from the same work, showing that the practical observations of mariners, engineers, and surveyors entirely ignore the doctrine that the Earth is a globe. The following cases taken from miscellaneous sources will be interesting, as bearing upon and leading to the same conclusion. In the Illustrated London News of October 20th, 1849, engraving is given of a new lighthouse erected on the Irish coast. The accompanying descriptive matter contains the following sentence: Ballycotton Island rises 170 feet above the level of the sea. The height of the lighthouse is 60 feet, including the lantern, giving the light an elevation of 230 feet, which is visible upwards of 35 miles to sea. If the 35 miles are nautical measure, the distance in statute miles would be over 40 miles, and allowing the usual distance for the horizon, there would be 36 miles from thence to the lighthouse. The square of 36 multiplied by 8 inches amounts to 864 feet. Deduct the total altitude of the lantern, 230 feet, and the remainder, 634 feet, is the distance which the light of Ballycotton ought to be below the horizon. In the Times newspaper of Monday, October 16th, 1854, in an account of Her Majesty's visit to Great Grimsby from Hull, the following paragraph occurs. Quote, their attention was, first, naturally directed to a gigantic tower which rises from the center pier to the height of 300 feet and can be seen 60 miles out to sea. End quote. The 60 miles, if nautical, and this is always understood when referring to distances at sea, would make 70 statute miles, to which the fall of 8 inches belongs, and as all observations at sea are considered to be made at an elevation of 10 feet above the water, for which 4 miles must be deducted from the whole distance, 66 statute miles will remain, the square of which, multiplied by 8 inches, gives a declination towards the tower of 2,904 feet. Deducting from this the altitude of the tower, 300 feet, we obtain the startling conclusion that the tower should be at the distance at which is visible, 60 nautical miles, more than 2,600 feet below the horizon. The only modification which can be made or allowed in the preceding calculations is that for refraction, which is considered by surveyors generally to amount to about 1/12 of the altitude of the object observed. If we make this allowance, it will reduce the various quotients by 1/12, which is so little that the whole will be substantially the same. Take the last quotation as an instance. 2,600 feet divided by 12 gives 206, which deducted from 2,600 leaves 2,384 as the correct amount for refraction. End section 13. The eye, as also did everything else which was reflected, and that this ought to be recorded as an addendum. Granted, the surface of the sea appeared to regularly ascend from the base of the Hoe to the distant horizon. The horizon from the extreme east to the west, as far as the eye could see, was a parallel to a horizontal line. End quote. The following version was recorded in the same journal of the same date, and was furnished by one of the committee, who had manifested. The following observations were also recorded. Quote, on the seafront of the Camera House, and at an elevation of 110 feet from the mean level of the sea, a plane mirror was fixed by the aid of a plumb line in a true vertical position. In this mirror, the distant horizon was distinctly visible on a level with the eye of the observer. This was the simple fact as observed by the several members of the committee which had been appointed. But some of the observers remarked that the line of the horizon in the mirror rose and fell, with a very marked aversion to the doctrine that the surface of all water is horizontal. Quote, a vertical looking glass was suspended from the camera, and the horizon seen in it, as well as various other objects reflected, rising and falling with the eye. The water was seen in the glass to ascend from the base of the hoe to the horizon. The horizon appeared parallel to a horizontal line. End quote. It will be observed that the two reports are substantially the same and very strongly corroborate the remarks made at It is worthy of note that the waves at the point H, whatever their real magnitude may be, are magnified and rendered more obstructive by the very instrument, the telescope, which is employed to make the objects beyond more plainly visible, and thus the phenomenon is often very strikingly observed, that while a powerful telescope will render the sails and rigging of a ship when beyond the point H, or the optical horizon, so distinct that the very ropes are easily distinguished, not the slightest portion of the hull can be seen. The quote, crested waters end quote, form a barrier to the horizontal line of sight as substantial as would the summit of an intervening rock or island. In the report which appeared in the Western Daily Mercury of October 25, 1864, the